Hi, this is Luann Worley from Rockin Book Reviews, and I'm so pleased to be here today with Harry Wegley. Harry and I connected a few years ago when he wrote his series of Voice in the Wilderness. It was such a fantastic book. I had to read the whole series. I just loved it. The writing was impeccable, and I loved the subject matter, and it was just suspenseful and interesting the whole book through. So I am so pleased to have you here, Harry, and learn more about you.
Thank you, Luann.
Tell us a little bit about your life growing up, what your youth was like.
Both my wife and I grew up in Southern Oregon in the 1950s and the very early 60s. The lumber industry was booming, so we had a vibrant economy. We had a tight-knit community. Everybody was there at the Friday night football games. And on top of all that, my buddies and I had about 1 million acres of forest land to roam, with rivers, lakes, fish to fish in, swim and hunt. And Pacific Ocean beaches were only a 90-minute drive away. So it was just a wonderful time and place to grow up. And when I wasn't enjoying the outdoors, I was playing football, basketball, running track, or playing baseball. There was just not much to worry about in those days. It was a good time to be a kid without having to worry about the problems we have today. Had a lot of fun adventures with my buddies, and we survived them all.
So, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Other than the Vietnam era and the war there, it was just a fantastic, but I know it was so sad during that time period is where the country took such a drastic turn. But you signed up into the Air Force. In the Air Force, you served as a weather officer and intelligence analyst. So tell us what your duties consisted of.
My first job in the Air Force was an intelligence analyst. The Air Force had promised me when I joined that I could have a 2-year scholarship with everything paid staff sergeant salary, and then go get my commission. But prior to that time, I spent 2 years as an intelligence analyst working closely with NSA. Much of that time was an NSA employee. We had our primary enemy during the Cold War was the Russians. So we took their communications that we intercepted and figured out what they were doing. That was my job. After I got my scholarship, I attended Texas A&M University to get a degree in meteorology. And from there, I went to officers training school, got my commission, and then out to my first duty assignment, which was at a Strategic Air Command base, where I served as the wing weather officer, providing weather support to a bomber wing, a missile wing, a fighter interceptor squadron, a helicopter squadron, and the base commander. And I was also the chief forecaster at the weather station. And that consists of 2 captain slots, which I was filling as a brand new second lieutenant. So it was sink or swim for me right off the bat. And sink was not an option because the American strategic forces, I had to supply the weather support so that the Russians knew we were not going to let anything get in the way of defending the United States of America. And if we did that to the best of our ability, that served as a deterrent to a nuclear war during those years. But reflecting back on when I was serving those positions, some of us as a very young man, I don't think those who've never served understand how much responsibility that we place on some very young men and women. Many of us had jobs where we could get a lot of Americans killed. We could cause billions of dollars of equipment to be destroyed. We could create international incidents that could lead to war. And we could do all that, some of us before we were 21. So there's a lot of responsibility put on our people that serve in the military, even when they're very young.
There is. My husband joined the Air Force also, and luckily he served in a portion of the Air Force that isn't there anymore. He had to be stationed remotely for 13 months after we'd been married only 10 months. So it was very difficult time, very hard on marriages. So your wife needs to be commended for hanging in there during those times.
I only had a few short times when I was away from the family. 3 months was the longest, and sometimes it was just a couple of weeks. So we were together almost the entire time, and we were very blessed, I think, at the time that we served.
Fantastic. That's wonderful because not too many had that opportunity to be together. In what ways did you assist the government as a research scientist and with atmospheric physics.
I was discharged from the Air Force. I got a job as a weather forecaster at the Hanford Atomic Energy Reservation, which is in eastern Washington. I sort of transitioned over the next year from that position to a research scientist position at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. There were two primary areas that I worked as a research scientist. The first one was I worked on a small team of about 5 scientists that developed a model that could predict the environmental impacts of placing a nuclear reactor at site in question. It was used for licensing nuclear power plants. That was its primary use, but the model also worked well for assessing the impact of an accident. If there's a nuclear accident, we would run the model on that area, and within about a 50-mile radius, we could tell what the exposures were going to be for anybody or anything in that area. Fortunately, I only had to run that model once for that purpose, and it was a fairly benign situation. Then I spent about 8 years working on a team of probably about 8 meteorologists, and we managed the meteorology for the Federal Wind Energy Program under the Carter and Reagan administration. Some of the things that we did were to determine the wind resource in detail for the US and a lesser degree of detail for the entire world. And we published all that in a set of atlases, which are still around and in use today. We also documented how to site wind turbines to get optimal power out. We evaluated the cost savings if wind turbines are integrated into a utility power grid and investigated means of predicting the power output for load forecasting from day to day and for longer periods of time if economics were there for wind energy in a utility grid. In short, we did all the basic research in wind energy that private industry couldn't really afford to do. That was the whole goal of the institute I worked for, the Battelle Memorial Institute, which ran this national lab. It was a nonprofit research institute that only tackled problems that private industry couldn't afford to do and which we could do with some government help.
In addition to all that, you developed a well-based computing system for Boeing Company. Tell us about that.
Well, what I did was, while I was doing the wind energy work, I was going to night school and got a master's in computer science. And after I got it, I jumped ship and came over to Western Washington and went to work for Boeing. The first system I worked on at Boeing for about 13, 14 years, we developed a distributed computing system that would distribute Boeing engineering data to wherever they were needed within the company, things like parts lists, engineering drawings, assembly instructions. And we also distributed those to the airlines so their maintenance people could do the maintenance and repair on airplanes. And that was a very successful project. Saved the company a lot of money. The second system was something I worked on for my last 5 years before I retired. Unfortunately, this is one of those projects that replaces a lot of people with an automated system. But we built a self-service human resource system so that employees could maintain all their human resource data themselves. Get on their web browser, log in, and they could manage their employee records, benefits, savings plan information, tax information, job transfers, just about anything an employee needs to do. It was very successful, but it did replace some human resource workers.
It's been beneficial during this COVID situation.
Yes. Any web-based system was very beneficial during COVID.
It amazes me how someone's mind like yours work with analyzing such top secret stuff as government security and inventing all the things that you have been a part of. So you're basically a very intelligent man, but yet you are a very religious man, and all of your books have been very full of adventure, thrills, and suspense, and without ever including any bad language and sex scenes. So you've maintained your strong convictions. How have you been able to endure the negative, if any? And how much negative have you had to endure?
Well, I think one of the things that really helped me, and it was before I even considered writing fiction, was it took about 10 years and studied Christian apologetics just on my own. Most of it, I was just reading the best apologists in the nation. But I did take a course called The Truth Project that Del Tackett taught. Went through that several times, taught it several times.
Harry, explain what is apologetics, Christian apologetics?
Apologetic is defense of your faith.
That's something you really have to study?
What you really study is you study the things that God has told us so that you establish a biblical worldview. In other words, God has spoken. There's no area of human endeavor that God has not spoken. So you're looking at all those areas of life and see, what does God have to say about this? And once you gain an understanding of that across all the areas of life, you've got a real strong foundation. And you've got a source of authority for each thing that you believe to point back to God himself and what he's written. So that's what you're doing when you study apologetics.
Thank you.
Well, in doing that, I revisited science and metaphysics, which is sort of physics, metaphysics, philosophy, science, and did that from an epistemological point of view. That is how we acquire knowledge from these systems of thought. And they reveal a lot about God's nature and his character. So my studies also clearly define the limits of science. That's something a lot of people get pretty sloppy with today. A lot of scientists get sloppy with it. That if you violate the underlying principles of science, you're going to come up with pseudoscience. And that happens all too much. So, but as a result of this 10-year excursion into apologetics, my biblical worldview, I think, is the point where it's not going to be easily shaken. And in addition, as I'm writing the characters in my books, a lot of the questions that people struggle with in their lives, I've studied, have answers for, and I can illustrate those in the characters in my books. And it's sort of an indirect way of teaching people apologetics, or at least certain areas of it that I touch upon in my stories. Hopefully that's been helpful for them. And when I started writing novels, I realized I was going to have to deal with some pretty unsavory topics that are just the fact that there's so much evil in the world, sexual immorality, profanity, other areas of bad behavior that can get a movie an R rating. So to decide how I was going to deal with that, I wrote out my philosophy of how I would handle these things in my writing. And I composed a short explanation that I put on each Amazon page for my books that were published on Amazon, so that any reader that reads about that book is going to see the statement that says they're going to never have to endure anything that's gross, graphic, or gratuitous when they read my book. Sometimes authors will say, well, what you're doing isn't realistic. You know, people don't talk that way, they don't act that way, they do all these bad things. Well, my answer to that is fiction is not reality, no matter how you slice it. It's an artifice that through which we simulate reality to tell a story. To tell the story that we want to tell. And an author has the right to do that any way they want to. For cussing, I usually put something in like, he swore at the captain until he ran out of food synonyms for idiot. Gets it across and people understand, and that's the way I chose to handle it anyway. About opposition, you mentioned that. I haven't had a lot of opposition unless I go on into the social media and start doing what they call trolling. Get a bad response from people when you jump into their conversation and debate them. But just for my writing, what I see is occasional one-star reviews for books. And almost inevitably, a one-star reviewer for my books has nitpicked the writing, criticized little bitty things all as much as they could. It was obvious that they were struggling to say bad things about the book, and that a lot of them I knew weren't true. And I saw that pattern happen enough that I finally figured out what was going on. They either didn't like the Christianity in the books, or they didn't like the politics in the books. And so this was a way of dealing with that and trying to persuade people not to read my books. I just kind of shrugged it off as that's what it was, and let it go with that.
They didn't succeed. And although a one-star rating really does hurt an author, it didn't hurt you that much, because in 2018, you won a couple awards. Tell us about it.
My series that you mentioned starts off with what's Voice in the Wilderness and Voice of Freedom and Chasing Freedom. That series, I submitted books 1 and 2 to Readers' Favorites International Awards. And for Christian thrillers that year, they won gold and silver. Books 1 and 2, gold and silver. My wife says it's my best 2 books, and a lot of the readers think so too. But I really credit a lot my mentor, Susan May Warren, who helped me figure out how to structure things in those stories that she knew what I wanted to tell, the basic story I wanted to tell. She's an amazing teacher.
Well, it was right on. And the things that was going on in the government then, it was very real. I mean, did you use any of your government experience and knowledge for that book?
Yeah, I don't think I had any meteorology in that one, but my heroine of the story was a computer genius, basically. She was brilliant. And so I was able to draw on my computer science background for that. And the hero of the story was a self-taught Christian apologist, and he dealt with a lot of people's questions So that drew on those aspects of my experience and training. And I've drawn on some other aspects. And like the NSA work that I did, a lot of that was useful for the security issues in this story.
I'm sure. You made me a fan. I'm now a great fan of yours.
Well, thank you.
But you also had a challenge in 2018 that kind of put a damper on things. Can you tell us about that challenge?
It gets to be really frustrating when you develop a medical condition that seems that there's very few doctors even know it exists, and even fewer know how to treat it. I had something that, well, the common name for it is silent reflux. It's a very insidious condition that over a period of a few months, I developed a set of really nagging symptoms that grew continually worse. Couldn't lay down to sleep. I lost most of my voice. Eating was so uncomfortable, I didn't do much of that. My sinuses were bleeding. I had asthma attack, and there were a lot of things beyond that. But it was impossible to concentrate right with so much going on. After 3 doctors couldn't correctly diagnose or help me with it, and I was just feeling so miserable. I couldn't sleep. I spent one whole night when I was really miserable on the internet. And I just searched for people who had the same symptoms that I did. And not only did I find a bunch of them, but I found one of them was a doctor who had developed her own method of treating herself. And when it was successful, she documented it in a book. As soon as I saw that book mentioned, I had a copy express mailed to me as fast as I could get my hands on it. So this is a doctor speaking to the same problem that I had. I was losing about 10 pounds per week and felt like I could maybe even die from it. So I opened this book when I got it, and I was both surprised and disappointed because all it was a diet. And she said that if I would stick to this diet, very stringent diet, if I stick to it for 2 weeks, I could have my life back and would feel nearly 100% better. It was impossible to believe at that point, but I was out of options. So I tried the diet. It worked. I was able to get all those symptoms under control. I felt like a human being again, and it was amazing. I still have some minor flare-ups, but they're just minor disruptions to my writing now. And with a little help also from my gastroenterologist, he gives me some other things to help on the side. And I got enough weapons in my arsenal to kind of nip the reflux in the bud whenever it happens. Our bodies are amazing creations. If we tap into the healing capabilities that God's given us, we can heal a lot of things.
You recently finished your new series of Ribbon Republic. Please tell us about the series and what inspired it.
As with most of my stories, this series gets its plot from a problem that's impacting people of our nation. That's usually where I look for a plot of a story, something that's happening in the U.S., happening to people that impacts people. And the problem in this series was a deep ideological division that our nation has is driving it civil war, basically. But when I look at problems like this, I think my problem as an author is not simply to point out that we've got a problem, that there's an issue, but also show a real world solution for that problem over the course of my story. Well, the fragmentation of America stems from 2 incompatible worldviews. Politically, we call one of those leftist thinking or progressivism, and the other right-wing constitutionalism. And what one view calls evil, the other one calls good, and vice versa. So there's no really common ground between them, and therefore there's no peaceful resolution to that conflict unless hearts and minds are changed at a very deep level. If I may, I'd like to read about a 90-second monologue that occurs in the first book in that series, because it kind of sets the stage for all of this.
Absolutely.
The hero of the book 1, Ribbon, is Zach Tanner. He's a conservative radio talk show host. And here's how he describes divided America in the opening chapter. So I'm reading for Zach now from his on-air monologue. America may not be where it was on March 4 of 1861, when Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, but many of the divisions that led to that terrible Civil War exist today. Divided views of our national history, divided views of our founding documents, of our monuments, of most of our symbols, of what it means to be a patriot and what it means to be an American. We're engaged in a cold civil war, but one that will grow hot given the slightest provocation. I believe many provocations are coming, and the incompatible political ideologies on the right and the left prevent any resolution but a violent one, a rending of our nation. It will not play out as it did in 1861, but every American will know that we are at war when one group crosses the line, a point of no return, leading a ribbon republic. And as the nation fragments in a de facto secession and struggles against itself, the question on each true American heart is, can we ever recover what we once had? The courts cannot save us from ourselves. No part of the federal government can. Maybe if enough pulpits echo the call to revival, God will move as he has in the past. Maybe the hearts and minds of millions will be changed, and we will find unity once again. At this critical juncture in American history, it appears that only an act of God can save this nation. That was Zach's monologue. It comes right at the beginning of the book, so it kind of sets the stage for what's going to happen.
It's really sad because my husband and I were talking the other day about this, and the media is centering on a few people, which makes it sound like the whole group, which it's not. We have many friends of other races and other beliefs, and they don't go along with all this. You know, it's just like the media has made it like it's the major part of the people that are rebelling, but it's not. And there's very conservative ideas among many of them. I think it's sad because just like in the South during the Civil War, the majority of the United States were against slavery, or they had slavery, so they fought harder for it. But that was the minority, but they made it sound like the majority of all the United States, which wasn't true. But anyhow, I like that. You have an upcoming mysterious event. Can you share with us what it is?
I can share a little bit. I'm a contributor to a multi-author box set that you'll begin hearing about in a couple of months. Since I'm pledged to secrecy, I can only reveal a bit about my contribution to that project. My story is a prequel that launches a new book series for me. And I can tell you a bit about what my book and the new series is about. I should probably start by saying that my wife and I live only about 15 miles from the original epicenter of the COVID outbreak in the United States. So in March of 2020, people were dying around us, and we knew very little about this disease. I became very distracted at that point. So I stopped writing for a while. I spent about 2 years researching the COVID-19 pandemic, its origin, its spike protein, method of infection, its impacts on our bodies, available prophylactics, early treatments, the vaccines when they came along, and the politics surrounding SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. Well, my story in this multi-author project is set slightly into the future, maybe like a couple of years, and it draws on much of what I learned about the virus and the CCP's, that's the Chinese Communist Party's, plans for the future, which include a much more deadly biowarfare weapon as part of their unrestricted warfare approach to world domination. I hope the series illustrates the existential danger to America that the CCP and the unrestricted warfare represents. They accomplish much of this via stealth and corruption, and that reminds me of a song that was written by a very talented Christian songwriter. The song's called If I Were the Devil. It has a line in it that goes something like this: if I were the devil, you'd never know. I'd befriend you quick and corrupt you slow. That's kind of what the CCP has done to us here in America. But back to my story. The heroine in the story is a young woman who's a brilliant young molecular virologist from the Hong Kong University Medical School. And she's lured to the Wuhan Institute of Virology by a very attractive postdoctoral fellowship that they offer her. And she gets there and starts doing her work, only to find that her breakthrough technology is going to be stolen and used for some of the deadliest biowarfare weapons that have ever been produced. That's where the adventure in my story begins. She takes all of her data, destroys the entire project data in the Wuhan lab, and flees to America with CCP agents in pursuit. There's a lot of action, suspense, and some light romance. I can't tell you much more than that right now, but I hope that whets your appetite.
Oh, it has. It can't be your book if it's not suspenseful. That is exciting. I'm so anxious to see that come out. Is there any further comments you have at this time?
Nothing I can think of, except I think you are going to do a giveaway. I can tell you what I'd like to give away, if I may.
That'll be great.
I'd like to give away a copy of the 3-book Ribbon Republic series, all 3 books.
Super.
Ribbon, Resisting, and Restored. If the winner's inside the US, I'll give away the winner's choice. They can have the 3-book paperback set or ebook format, Kindle or EPUB or PDF. Outside the US, I think I can only give away the ebook series.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a lot. Thank you. And I'm excited to have you in my new blog and celebrating all my new 9th blogversaries. You are a very important part of that blog because you are one of the key people that really helped me keep going when I was about ready to quit because I was so discouraged with the problems I was having with the technology. So you were an inspiration to me, and I really appreciate your books and contacting me at that time. And it's so great having you here and finally meeting you.
Good to meet you too. And thank you very much for having me on your set of videos that you're doing now and blog posts.
I can't think of anyone better. So, okay. So this is Lou Ann Worley closing off and hoping that you'll all search the universe through books. Goodbye now.